Message from outer space to the viewers of this video. Please enjoy our coverage of the 2022 Exeter UFO Festival. The views expressed in this program are those of the speakers. They do not reflect the views of Exeter TV, the Town of Exeter, or the Select Board. To learn more about the festival, visit exeterufofestival.org. Start video countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off.
Kathleen Marden is a researcher, author, on-camera expert, and conference presenter. She is widely considered one of the leading UFO contact researchers of our time, and with good cause, I might add. Since 1990, she has researched the perplexing nature of UFOs and the non-human entities associated with highly advanced aerial vehicles via her own, her own groundbreaking research, investigation, and experimentation. Her research has extended to archival collections and the U.S. government's involvement in the investigation of UFOs and its major studies. This has combined to give her a depth of knowledge that few possess. Kathleen is a 2013 recipient of MUFON's Researcher of the Year Award and the 2021 Researcher of the recipient of the International UFO Congress's Lifetime Achievement Award. She earned a BA degree in social services from the University of New Hampshire and was employed as an educator and education services coordinator while attending graduate school. Kathleen's interest in UFOs and contact began in 1961, when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and a subsequent abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. Kathleen spent 15 years in painstaking investigation of the Hill abduction case, and as our technology progresses, she continues to search scientific analysis for this compelling evidence. She has worked on 3 comprehensive studies of nearly 5,000 experiencers, 2 of which she initiated and saw to through the end, and has 6 professionally published books. Her bestseller with nuclear physicist, the late great Stanton T. Friedman, is Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. She and Stanton authored 2 additional books, Science Was Wrong and Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. Her book with Denise Stoner, The Alien Abduction Files, includes her investigation of 6 intergenerational cases of ET contact. Her 5th book, Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted, is a comprehensive guide to abduction phenomena. Read her latest bestseller, Forbidden Knowledge: A Personal Journey from Alien Abduction to Spiritual Transformation, for deeper insight into Kathleen's own life and works. Her essays have been published in several additional books and magazines. Her books are available in all formats on Amazon and with Barnes & Noble. Autographed copies can be purchased from her website, kathleen-marden.com. Kathleen Marden has given expert on-camera commentary on numerous television shows and documentaries, and her lectures at conferences and colleges nationally and internationally. The subject of her talk today is Betty and Barney Hill, their UFO abduction, and today's jaw-dropping evidence. Please welcome New Hampshire's own Kathleen Marden.
Somebody's going to bring that up for me. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Peter. Okay, so I guess I can thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so it's great to be back in Exeter. I grew up in Kingston. My grandfather was a farmer there, and he was on the Board of Selectmen in Kingston. My aunt was Betty Hill. She was born in Newton Junction and grew up in Kingston, and she was my mother's sister. So I went to Sanborn Seminary and then the University of New Hampshire, and moved around to different areas of the country over the years, but now I live in Florida. So it's really nice to be back at the Exeter UFO Festival, and thank you for coming. I don't know why. Okay. Okay, so for an overview on what I'm going to speak about today, the basic facts on the Hill case, the documented evidence, the hypnosis, the new scientific analysis of the evidence, what we know about UFOs and ET contact now, our government's recent Freedom of Information Act releases, and the primary implications for humanity's future based upon open-ended questions that we've had on the three major studies that I have worked on, two of those with PhD academics on experiencers of contact. So here are Betty and Barney with their dog Delcy, who is with them. And next to them, to the left, is Stanton Friedman and myself. We were at the American Philosophical Society there doing archival research on what he used to call the debunkers, but I say that most of them are disinformants, because debunkers uncover the bunk and set the story straight. They've added the bunk. So that's why I call them disinformants. The 60th anniversary edition of my book with Stanton, I have just updated it with new scientific analysis of some of the evidence, and the award that I received from the International UFO Congress, the Lifetime Achievement Award, which was a really huge honor for me for all of the years of investigation and research that I've done. Thank you. So who were Betty and Barney Hill? Well, Betty, as I said earlier, grew up on a farm in South Kingston, New Hampshire, West Shore Park Road. And her parents were Raymond and Florence Barrett. I grew up across the street from them. And Betty went to the University of New Hampshire. She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, working first in child welfare and adoption, and she later became a supervisor in the welfare department. And she lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Barney was from Philadelphia. As a kid, he spent a lot of time on the family farm in Virginia. He served honorably in the Army during World War II, and when he was discharged, he went to work for the post office. Both Betty and Barney were married previously, before they met and married. They married in 1960 after several years of courtship. And what you see here is they were very involved in politics. And this is actually my invitation to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. They were very good role models for me, mentors. And so I was invited to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration along with them. Betty and Barney are outlined there at the front on the first row. To the right, and then I'm in the back row. Now, 1965 was a great year for Barney. In We went to the Lyndon Johnson's inauguration, and then Barney was given an award by Sergeant Shriver from the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity for leading the effort to set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program. And so he was the first chairman of the committee that set that up. He was given that award. Betty was right by his side the entire time, but Barney received the awards. In the center, you can see where it says Barney Hill, NAACP Director and Executive Board Member of the Rockingham County Community Action Program, received this award. He was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that year as well. So this was for the state of New Hampshire, and that was a huge honor for him for the work that he did in civil rights. He marched with Martin Luther King as well, so very active along with my aunt on the seacoast, and I did what I could as a high school student. And in 2011, the state of New Hampshire erected this historical marker to commemorate the experience that Betty and Barney had. One of the speakers here, Mike, was the person who came up with the idea of petitioning the state of New Hampshire. And then he got in touch with me. He had 50 signatures on a petition. And I ended up submitting that to Concord. And they asked me to provide at least a couple of dozen samples of evidence that proves that this was real, that it happened in New Hampshire, and that Betty and Barney were who they said they were. So I did that, and that was probably in 2008 or 9. It was several years before they erected the marker. I was really thrilled when they finally did. If you go to my website, you will find a self-guided tour to the close encounter route that Betty and Barney took through the White Mountains, and you'll be able to stop and see that historical marker in front of the Indian Head Resort. So I had something to do with the trip that Betty and Barney took. I had gone to Niagara Falls with my Aunt June and Uncle Alex and cousin Sherry that very summer. And Betty and Barney visited our house at least once a week, sometimes more frequently than that. And I had the photographs, and I was excited, and I was talking about what a great time I had. So Barney said to Betty, "Have you been there?" And she said no. He said, "Do you think you'd like to go sometime?" And she said she would like to. So she had a week's vacation from her job as a social worker, and he decided to surprise her with this trip in September of 1961. That's me at the top standing in front of Niagara Falls when I was 13. So I'm going to just quickly go over this, but I'm going to read to you from the original reports after that. So this was the first stop at the Mount Cleveland picnic area at 11:15. Betty had spotted the new light in the sky that was traveling upward in Lancaster, just south of Lancaster. She continued to watch it as it came in closer and closer. And so Barney agreed to stop the car and walk the dog there, and then got back into the car. And they entered Franconia Notch by the Hugh Gallen Bridge. It's a separate road than what is there today. So you can get off at Cannon Mountain, and you'll see the signs to the Hugh Gallen Bridge if you want to get a view of what Betty and Barney were looking at as they entered Franconia Notch in 1961. So at the top you can see a building. Betty saw the craft passing over the top of that building. There's also a lighted building up there, a fire tower. And the light blinked out on the building as the craft passed overhead. That could be an indication that there was a strong electromagnetic field. They stopped again by the Old Man of the Mountain, which was just south of there. It was easy access in those days. They just pulled over to the side of the road. And the craft now was rotating. It was hovering next to the Old Man of the Mountain's profile. Betty said that it was at least 1.5 to 2 times the length of the profile. And then as Betty and Barney moved, when they started the car again, it traveled along next to them through the mountains. When they left Franconia Notch, the craft was moving in closer and closer. And Betty was asking Barney to stop the car and look at it. As he was looking for a place to pull over, the craft swooped ahead and stopped over the highway, causing Barney to have to stop in the middle of the highway on Route 3. This is actually Walter Webb, the original investigator's photograph of that area. It was taken in about 1962 or 3. And it shows, I couldn't move that car to the middle of the road. It was parked to the side. So it was the wrong angle for me to move it with my photo program. But he pulled to the middle of the road. That's Barney actually standing at the door, demonstrating how he got out of the car and looked at the craft that was there, and then it moved to an adjacent field and descended even lower. When Barney was in the field, he looked at non-humans looking back at him, and they frightened him greatly. So what you see there is a beam. He didn't know what was dropping down from the bottom of the craft at that time, but that is an actual photograph that I have of a beam coming from a craft. It's the carrier beam that takes humans into the craft. And a little later I'm going to show you that and the entities dropping off it. And so he drew this sketch to the right when he arrived home. At the top, it's how it looked when it was about 200 feet in the air. And at the bottom, it's how it looked when he saw the entity standing in it. So he always had this memory. He did not forget this. It's in the earliest files and reports. Barney was afraid that he was going to be captured like a bug in a net. He went screaming back to the car to Betty that they had to get out of there. He'd left the car running, the door was open, and he hopped into the car, and as he was getting into the car, he noticed that the craft was moving in his direction. He went speeding down the highway, and when he did, there were a series of code-like buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk of the car. It caused the car to vibrate and a tingling, kind of an electrical tingling sensation to pass through Betty's and Barney's bodies. It left shiny spots on the trunk of the vehicle where it was striking the trunk. And they sort of had vague memories of what occurred after that. They didn't remember the abduction itself, but they always had vague memories of finding themselves on a dirt road with tall trees all around, a roadblock they didn't know where or when it occurred, and a fiery orb that appeared to be sitting on the ground. They looked for that place for years before they saw Dr. Benjamin Simon for hypnosis, and finally found it on Labor Day in 1965 after the hypnosis. So this is one of the old maps, the 61 map of New Hampshire, and in red on the little cutout, it shows the route where they saw the craft and where they were taken. So number 1, the first stop, Mount Cleveland, second stop, Cannon Mountain, third stop, the Close Encounter Field in North Lincoln, south of the Indian Head Resort, and then 4, the abduction site in Thornton. When they arrived home, there was troubling evidence and they had memories of what had occurred except for the abduction itself. So at the top, I talked about the spots on the car. Those are not the actual spots. We never did take a photograph of that. I created that from memory because I saw those spots. My mother was talking to Betty on the phone when I arrived home from school that day when I was 13 years old. And within 2 days, my family and I went to Betty's and Barney's home and saw some of the evidence. So at the top right, you can see the watch that Betty was wearing that night. It had stopped, and Barney's watch had stopped and never ran again. But when she arrived home, saw that it had stopped. She set it for the time that she arrived home, 5:16 a.m. And she wound it, it never ran again. So that's the actual watch. And her earrings were missing. She didn't realize that. But that fall, when she and Barney were out for the day, they were returned to her home. And they walked in, and they were in a pile of withered leaves. Betty and Barney were very distressed by that, and my father helped Barney put deadbolt locks on the house after that. These are my husband's shoes, actually, but Barney was wearing his best dress shoes that were so deeply scraped he had to buy new shoes. And you'll hear his recording on when that happened. And then Betty's dress that was torn from waist to hemline, the top of the zipper was torn, and there's been a great deal of scientific testing on that dress. They made statements to Pease Air Force Base the following day, because my father's friend was the chief of police in Newton, New Hampshire, and he told my mother to tell Betty that she should make a report to Pease, that Pease Air Force Base had called the police stations in the area and said if anyone observes a UFO, have them contact us and make a report. So this is part of the Blue Book report. You'll see it here. It changed direction abruptly. It stopped and hovered in the air. When it swooped down, it was the size of a dinner plate held at arm's length. Keep in mind that the full moon is the size of an aspirin held at arm's length. While hovering, objects began to appear from the body of the object like wings with a V shape extended. So those slid out from the craft. And at this point, they decided to get out of there, and fast. Mrs. Hill watched by sticking her head out the window, but her view was obstructed, and this prevented her observation of its departure. They heard short, loud buzzes that they described like someone had dropped a tuning fork in Lincoln. They could feel these buzzes. They heard them again about 30 miles south of Lincoln near Ashland, but they did not see the object at this time. Mrs. Hill described the flight pattern as erratic. It changed directions rapidly. During its flight, it ascended and descended numerous times very rapidly. Its flight was described as jerky, not smooth. So this is the original report to Pease Air Force Base. Then Betty had never read a book on UFOs, and so she went to the Portsmouth Public Library and checked out her first book on the subject. It was written by Donald Kehoe, who was the National Director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a private group in Washington, D.C., comprised of former military personnel and scientists and some members of the general public as well. So Betty sat down with Barney and typed that letter. And I'm going to quote a little bit from that. This is what she wrote about Barney's sighting. As it glided closer, he was able to see inside this object, but not too closely. He did see many figures scurrying about as though they were making some kind of hurried type of preparation. One figure was observing us from the windows. From the distance this was seen, the figures appeared to be about the size of a pencil and seemed to be dressed in some type of shiny black uniform. That's a pencil at arm's length. And at this point, my husband became shocked and got back in the car in a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating that they were going to capture us. He started driving the car. The motor had been left running. As we started to move, we heard several buzzing or beeping sounds which seemed to be striking the trunk of the car. And then Betty had 5 dreams, and 5 dreams only. They occurred the first thing in the morning just before she woke up. So she was in a hypnotic state, and the dreams contain some of memories that she and Barney both recalled, but sandwiched in between those memories was an alien abduction. She wrote those down, and I was very pleased for that because I have all of 10 hours of the hypnosis tapes, and I was able to transcribe them and do a comparative analysis of Betty's and Barney's statements, separate statements under hypnosis. I wanted to test the hypothesis that Betty only repeated her dreams under hypnosis and that Barney had absorbed the information in her dreams and only repeated her dreams under hypnosis. That hypothesis was defeated through my sentence by sentence, line by line comparative analysis. It's all in my book. And they made a report to NICAP, as I said, and Walter Webb, who was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston, drove up, and he interviewed Betty and Barney together and separately. And this is part of his confidential report. Betty and Barney never intended to go public. They were willing to speak to UFO investigators, to scientists, to military officers. They told the family, but we were sworn to secrecy, and they told some of their friends, as well as their minister and their church group. So Walter wrote in the report, the approaching UFO finally filled up the entire field of the binoculars. The leader at the window had a special attraction for the witness and frightened him terribly. The witness could almost feel this figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. Mr. Hill believed that he was going to be captured like, quote, a bug in a net, close quote. That is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft that he was observing, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, beings that were somehow not human. Here are some quotes from his report. The band of lights was not continuous, but the object occupied about half the entire rim. The other half was dark, causing a twinkling or blinking effect when the object rotated. The UFO came around to the front of the car and stopped in midair to the right of the highway, 80 to 100 feet above the ground. On the lighted edge of the object, a double row of windows through which a cold bluish-white fluorescent glow shone was visible, and a red light on each side of the object was seen. The UFO was no longer spinning. Mr. Hill braked the car to a halt, but left the headlights on and the engine running. He opened the door on his side and stepped out onto the highway for a better look through binoculars. At that moment, the UFO shifted position from the right to the left in front of the car and hovered in midair. Barney followed it when it moved across the highway. The object tilted downward slightly and began descending in his direction. Now he could see 8 to 11 figures, separate figures, watching him. They were dressed in black shiny uniforms and caps with peaks or bills on them. Suddenly there was a burst of activity. Everyone turned in unison toward what seemed to be a panel, and only one remained at the window. The craft filled the entire field of his binoculars. The one at the window showed an intense concentration on Barney, and he could almost feel their plan, that they were going to carry out a plan. Barney believed that he was going to be captured like a bug in a net. That is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, beings that were somehow not human. The object was now 50 to 80 feet up and possibly 50 to 100 feet away. So that's from the original report in early October 1961. Barney experienced ontological shock. Barney wanted to forget about that as soon as he possibly could. But Betty was a lot like me. She was very curious. She wanted to learn all that she could. And so Barney couldn't forget about it. There was the physical evidence, and it bothered him greatly. He ended up seeing Dr. Duncan Stevens after he was hospitalized with bleeding ulcers. He had a life-threatening condition, and he was eventually referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston. And Benjamin Simon treated Barney for a period of 6 months and also agreed to see Betty separately, so in all 6 months. Here's Dr. Simon, and he reinstated amnesia at the end of each session so that Betty and Barney couldn't share information and contaminate each other's information. And also, at times, the release of traumatic emotion was so great, if they remembered it immediately, it would have caused greater trauma. So he was a neuropsychiatrist. He worked very carefully with Betty and Barney separately. This is Barney.
I think I am going up a slight incline, and my feet are not bumping on the rocks. That's funny. I thought of my feet bumping on the rocks.
Is the explanation for how the tops of Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to buy new shoes after that experience. Both he and Betty were taken onto the craft. Her dress was torn, the lining of her dress was torn because Barney, she said, was no protection. He was being escorted by an entity on each side, and he appeared to be unconscious at that point, but he was awake. He was just keeping his eyes closed. He was afraid that if he fought, that he would be harmed. So Betty kicked the entity next to her, trying to get away, and tore her dress that way. She and Barney were taken to separate examining rooms and given physical examinations. These entities were very interested in their physical structure, the muscular structure, their skeletal structure, the way their joints moved, their hands, their feet, their neurology, their eyes, their ears, the fact that Betty had teeth and Barney had dentures, that sort of thing. Betty was taken first, and her zipper was torn because the entity did not know how to unzip a zipper, and it was torn when he was attempting. She ended up unzipping it, but the zipper was already torn. They were given physical examinations. Betty had the opportunity to talk to the leader, and we're going to get into that as well, while Barney had his examination. A very long needle was placed in Betty's navel years before amniocentesis was being used in hospitals, and there was also a sperm sample taken from Barney. These entities knew what they were doing. They were set up to do this. Even though they were the first scientifically investigated case in the United States, I have investigated cases that occurred before 1961. So Betty said to the leader, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And so he did something to the wall, and he produced this sort of three-dimensional star map. It was sort of like looking out a window. There were stars of various sizes and colors, and he explained to her that some of them were trade routes, the solid lines, and some of them, the dotted lines, were expeditions. He said to her, "Do you know where you are on this map?" And she said, "No, I don't." And he said, "If you don't know where you are, there's no point in my showing you where I'm from." And so then he made the map disappear. That's different from Betty's dreams. In Betty's dreams, she was pulling like a paper classroom map down. So there was 61 technology in Betty's dreams. There was technology that she could hardly describe in what really happened. Here are some messages that Betty and Barney were given. I don't have long today. There are many messages, and there's a lot of information in my book. For Betty, don't be afraid. You don't have any reason to be afraid. We're not going to harm you. We just want to do a few tests, and when the tests are over with, we'll take you and Barney back and put you in your car, and you'll be on your way back home. And then she began to trust the leader. When he escorted her back to the car, Barney had already been taken down, which is separate, different from Betty's dreams. But she wondered if he could come back, that she might be able to introduce him to scientists or to military officers. And he said, "Well, it's not my decision to make. Maybe we can come back." And she said, "Well, how will you find me? Out of all the people on this planet, how would you find me?" And he said, "We can always find those that we're looking for." So I kind of wonder if maybe they had taken her before that, because my research indicates that the vast majority of experiencers are taken for the first time before they turn 20. For Barney, a couple of the important messages were he did not speak with words, meaning the ET. I was told what to do by his thoughts, making my thoughts understand. And I could hear him. He could hear a mumming sound. And I could not understand, yet I could understand him. And I was told I would not be harmed. And then Dr. Simon said to Barney, do you feel that you were kidnapped? And Barney replied, I do not feel that I was kidnapped, because when I think of kidnapping, I think that someone was harmed, and I wasn't harmed. So he was frightened terribly. But in the end, he realized that he wasn't harmed. He had nothing to fear. And then there was a violation of confidentiality in 1965. John Luttrell was talking to Lori D'Alessandro, who was an investigator for NICAP in Massachusetts, and she gave him a great deal of information. He conducted his own investigation. He found 6 witnesses to the craft that night in separate locations, and by the time it was all over with, he'd found at least a dozen witnesses to the craft. And so he did contact Betty and Barney. They refused to speak with him. They said they didn't want any publicity. It was all confidential. But he spoke to the Air Force. He spoke to NICAP officers. He spoke to a lot of people. He even went to Betty and Barney's home. They had left, and he spoke to their neighbors to find out what kind of people they were. The part that I really resent is that he published their home address and telephone number in the newspaper articles that ran for 5 nights in the Boston Herald Traveler. So one thing that he did write is that during his investigation, he said that there was a writer from the Air Force who had falsified a typed report by mistake using the date September 21, 1965 instead of September 21, 1961. And the adjusted report no longer mentions the craft's unusual flight pattern and the Air Force's own radar report. So this is the timeline from when it began in September of '61 to when Betty and Barney made their reports, to the hypnosis in late 1963 is when they met with Dr. Simon the first time, through June 1964. Public awareness in 1965, and with John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, in 1966. And then with the movie, the UFO incidents starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons in 1975, the disinformation campaign ramped up and was pretty horrific, trying to convince the public that none of this was real, rewriting the entire event, adding speculation and disinformation. So, the scientific evaluation of the evidence. Marjorie Fish was a brilliant woman from Ohio. She did the first research on Betty's star map that she drew as the result of post-hypnotic suggestion given to her by Dr. Benjamin Simon to draw, if she could remember it accurately, and it didn't trouble her too much. So she did draw the star map. Marjorie saw it in John Fuller's book. She started writing and talking to Betty, and so she was able to identify it. After several years, she had to go to the university. It was very laborious. She had to hand copy all the distance data, the characteristics of the nearby stars out 54 light years from the sun. And she built 14 models and still didn't have a match. But finally, we developed new technology, and we were were able to get better distance data. And so she took that distance data and she applied it to the star maps and was finally able to find a match. Now, all of the stars on Betty's map are sun-like, although only 5% of the stars in our local galactic neighborhood, out 54 light years, are sun-like. And all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space are on Betty's map. Not only that, but they're in a plane, which would make travel from nearest star to nearest star easier than going back and forth and back and forth. And there's been an update on Betty's map. Now there were 2,289 models used, computerized models by an astrophysicist. And what was written is the fish model is the closest match of the nearest stars, 89%. There might be 2 stars that are a better match. A clear pattern of exploration emerged based on what we know about exoplanets and the ability to remotely detect potential life-bearing worlds. And that seems to be anything but random. Furthermore, it was based on information that was not known to anyone on Earth in 1961 or until recently. There was also 2 academic studies done on symbols that experiencers observed on craft and then had sketched for Bud Hopkins. So Dr. Don C. Donderi from McGill University, research psychologist, spent his years as a professor there. Dr. Stuart Appel from the State University of New York in Brockport, New York. And Bud Hopkins is at the bottom because he supplied the sketches that the experiencers sketched under hypnosis when they remembered these symbols. I asked Betty to draw from memory the symbols that she saw on the craft when I was doing my investigation. And she drew this. And this was not published. It was in my locked files at that time. It was published in 2007 when my first book was published, Uncaptured. And so Dr. Donderi had already done those studies, and he saw Betty's symbols, and this is what he wrote about them. The symbols Betty remembered that were published for the first time in 2007 look remarkably like many of the symbols that Hopkins had been collecting from abductees since 1975, and they had never been published. I have a whole collection of alien symbols now. Betty took and passed a polygraph exam on the F. Lee Bailey lie detector show back in 1982, administered by Ed Gelb, who was the past president of the American Polygraph Association. 2 questions. Did you obtain the star map from a source other than a UFO? No. And do you believe your story is a hoax? No. So she passed with no sign of deception. There was the dream hypothesis that I told you about earlier, and all of that is false. My line-by-line comparative analysis of the hypnosis tapes refutes the dream hypothesis. And this was, at the top, the ET in Betty's dreams. It looked very human. But down at the bottom is the ETs that Betty and Barney remembered under hypnosis. There have been many scientific investigations of this case. The most recent ones were one in 2020. I was up at the University of New Hampshire with Ben Hansen, and he discovered a stain on the lining of Betty's dress. He used to work for the FBI, and it was in the area of her navel. And we had never sampled that before, and so he wanted to sample that. So I cut the sample. I sent it to the Mutual UFO Network scientist at their laboratory, and she did a DNA analysis on that. I supplied Betty's DNA that I had the blood on a disc. Now, the blood on both samples were too old to determine if they were blood or just fluid from Betty's body, but they discovered that it was Betty's DNA, that fluid, in the area of Betty's navel. So this might confirm Betty's memory of the needle that was inserted into her navel, because this did not bleed through to the outside of the dress. It was only on the lining. Also, University of Pittsburgh in 2021 found rare, expensive metals with a high melting point on Betty's dress. There was no logical explanation for how they got there, and very expensive, rare metals. There were several before that. The chemical analysis supports Betty's account of the event. Seedling samples watered with pink powdery substance from Betty's dress, and with plain water with the pink powder, they grew at a very fast rate, which was highly unusual. And then the original one at the University of Cincinnati, that very long reports, but the white on the dress is strange in relation to the inorganic elemental compound. It was high in organic hydrocarbons. So where do we stand today in our level of knowledge? Because I continue to investigate and research cases. And this is from the study that Dr. Don Derry and Dr. Michael Austin Melton and I and some other members of MUFON's experiencer research team did in from 2015 to 2018. And we had asked the members of our team, we have about 50 now, when they were talking with experiencers of contact, if they believed this was a real case, there was evidence, that they should ask them to complete the survey. And then we selected 175 people who were willing to complete Dr. Don Derry's American Personality Inventory. And that inventory is able to identify those who have UFO abduction syndrome, who are real abductees, versus those who are wannabes, and those who, in the general public, who are just hoaxers. And so we had some very interesting results. We were able to identify the abductees and compare their information to the experiencers in general. And we were able to eliminate all of the people who were hoaxers or who didn't complete the survey. So one of the questions, we had 115 questions. We had 516 people. And do you have conscious recall of observing a UFO at less than 500 feet in the distance? Survey takers, 65%, abductees, 70%. Were there witnesses with you? Survey takers, 46%, abductees, 50%. Do you have conscious continuous recall of observing non-humans or alien entities, not with hypnosis, dreams, or flashbacks? Survey takers, 54%, and abductees, 54%. Have family members observed a UFO close up? 50% for the survey takers, 60% for the abductees. Have family members been abducted? 41% for the survey takers, 60% for the abductees. So more evidence that this follows generational lines. And this is the case that I've talked to many of you about. This is my most recent big evidence case. Pam Nance is at the top. Ashley Field, who is actually Pam's stepdaughter. Pam married Ashley's father when Ashley was already a married adult, but Pam had known Ashley since she was 8 years old. And then at the bottom, Chris Bledsoe and myself. How many, can I see a show of hands, how many know of Chris Bledsoe's experience? Okay, a few in the audience. Chris had an experience, his first was back in 2007 when he was fishing on the Cape Fear River with 3 of his employees and his son, and a UFO came in close, and Chris was walking up to his truck, and he went missing for a couple of hours. They looked for him, they couldn't find him. He finally returned, and he had been hospitalized. He had Crohn's disease, very, very bad. He was disabled with Crohn's disease, and he was healed during that time on the craft. The government has investigated this case. Jim Sullivan, who had a high position in the CIA, investigated it and made the statement that he believes it is real. And also Colonel John Alexander, Dr. John Alexander, has investigated Chris's case as well. So the way that I met the 2 women involved is they were paranormal investigators in North Carolina, highly respected, and they wanted to meet with an experiencer of contact who had a confirmed case to see if they could collect evidence, EVPs, photographic evidence, and so they went, I arranged for them to go to Chris's house, and he agreed, and they went and they interviewed him, and then they set up their equipment. So Pam has a master's degree in archaeology. She's worked on 150 scientific manuscripts on clinical medical trials. She spent her entire adult career in the medical research facility at the university. But she has a personal history of contact too. When at age 10, her parents found her unconscious in the yard. She was missing from the home. She always thought that she had ghosts in the house, and that's why she became a paranormal researcher. But I hypnotized her and Ashley a year apart, and they weren't speaking at that time. They had a falling out after they were abducted. And so it was good for me because they hadn't discussed any memories. Pam was traumatized at first, but finally she had EMDR therapy, and then she came down to Florida to see me, and I'd already investigated the case. I did another 8 or so hours of interviews with her and spent a day with quantum healing hypnosis. She had actually acquired rheumatoid arthritis after her exposure to the craft and psoriatic arthritis. Now, in the quantum healing hypnosis technique method, I've learned to use that method to channel healing to people, and she was healed and remains healed. Sometimes she'll begin to have symptoms, but she has the transcript of that, and so she listened to the hypnosis recording for the healing, and she's again healed from that. Also, Chris Bledsoe developed rheumatoid arthritis. I've interviewed him, but he hasn't been to my house. I haven't been to his due to COVID. And Ashley was in a different part of the craft. She did not develop arthritis. So This is Chris's yard. He no longer lives here, but there was a tree in the top, where the top star is on the right, and Ashley had set up their video camera. This was Bell and Howell, kind of old-fashioned camera, and set it up and left it running. And then Pam, Ashley, and Chris were on the other side of that row of hedges looking out. It was about 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night, and Chris thought he was seeing craft come in. And so Ashley started Pam started to ask questions. She is receiving EVPs, and they're trying to take 35mm pictures. And all of a sudden, they no longer have the equipment they're holding in their hands. They're all holding on to each other, standing up, reeling back and forth, feeling nauseated. They finally find the equipment under that row of bushes, and they pick it up, they head to the house, they pick up the camera that was by the tree, and they go into the house, and Chris's wife said to them, "Where have you been?" And they said, "Just outside." And she said, "No, you weren't. I was looking for you. You weren't there." They had nearly 2 hours of missing time, and were taken to Kraft. It's a very interesting story, but I want to show you they discovered video. There were a few seconds of video of the abduction in progress, and it doesn't show them, it shows the entities coming in. So I'm going to show you, I did a frame-by-frame analysis on the video. I'm going to show you the video, and then I'm going to show you the stills from the frames. So here we that's where the camera was recording, and here you'll see an entity rise up, small, white, unimpressive at that point. You're going to see a flash of light and an entity that's up close to the camera. So what I found on that film, on the different frames, as I lightened them and enlarged them, is up here is an entity that I think is the one that looks like a fairy. She is translucent at that point and has just come, or is coming off that beam. She falls down toward the ground. You can see her, it looks like she has a wand in her hand. She reminds me of Tinkerbell, but she has very large feet. It's that type that took Ashley. This one I found sitting on the ground first over on the right. You can see that the top of his head, his hands are down on the ground, his legs are crossed, and then he becomes enveloped in this blue light, and he just rises up into the air, and it appears that he's sitting on something. He glides across the screen. He has a blue light in one hand. I think that that is the light that he's going to capture them in and take them into the craft. And he might have a white light in another hand, but he's just gliding across, looking like this, from side to side as he glides. This is a close-up of the one that you saw when the light flashed from the craft. So it has, down here is its body. You can see a black body. It's kind of almost an accordion kind of pleats, and it's wearing some kind of headgear. And over there to the left, in the larger frame, if you're close up, you'll be able to see kind of a chiseled nose that sticks out, a couple of eyes, and kind of looks like a broad mouth. But a lot of it is just the headgear. They were human types. They looked sort of like us, but not just like us. They had larger eyes. There were 2 women and 2 men. They said that they had at one time lived on this planet, that there was an environmental collapse, that they had the technology to travel with a few people to another star system. They found a planet, Adela, that is mostly in twilight, and they don't take anything from our planet. Others do, but they come back from time to time just to check up on us. They told Pam that they had known her through all lifetimes. It's pretty unusual. And this is another one that Ashley has a history with. I believe it's the insectoid, the mantis type. You can see on its head, it looks like a triangular face. Let me show you this. Here's the head. Right here, and you can see these kind of mitten-type hands, very large hands. That's characteristic of the mantis types. And now the government has finally come out with some soft disclosure, and the Defense Intelligence Agency has recently released some information through the Freedom of Information Act in their files. So what they've released is that flight capabilities are vastly beyond our second-generation technology. There is instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity, low observability, anti-gravity capabilities, and transmedium travel in our atmosphere and under our bodies of water very easily. They can hover in the air at 60,000 feet for 8 hours without moving, and they can drop in less than a second down to 20,000 feet, and then in less than a second to above the ocean churn. And there was one that bounced back and forth like a ping pong ball over one as large as an aircraft carrier that was under the water and appeared to be communicating with it. That's in the naval reports. I would also say they travel in space as well. 1,574 pages of declassified documents were released. They talk about reports of a capture and release program on humans, unaccounted for pregnancies, levitation, and telepathic communication, the medical impact of exposure on humans. And John Schuessler, who was a NASA engineer, and he spent his lifetime doing that, but he was also one of the founders of the Mutual UFO Network and was a director of MUFON for a few years, released a report on UFO-related human physiological effects. I purchased that when he released it. It's very good. It talks about physiological effects on humans in South America, Central America, and here. And so here's Betty with John. John's in the center, and me when I was a lot younger with them. So also the Defense Intelligence Agency has this reference document, anomalous acute and subacute field effects on human biological tissues. And so what they have written about the consequences of getting up too close to a craft, and that's happened to people who are being taken to craft too by accident. Warping of time and space, we all know that, the missing time. Electromagnetic heating and radiation burns. People can become ill from exposure to that. Damage to the nervous system, cognitive damage, damage, hair loss, nausea, unaccounted for pregnancies, telepathy, poltergeist activity, orbs, shadow entities, and other high strangeness events in the home, and Marian apparitions. And Chris Bledsoe is one who has had twice Marian apparitions of what he calls as a lady, it's a blonde lady in white, who simply materializes in front of him. And at one time, she gave prophecy about a time of tribulation here on our planet. This was back before COVID, and then we had COVID, and I can't remember the date, but fairly soon we're going to have the emergence of the divine feminine, is what Chris was told. So the primary implications for humanity's future. This is from the open-ended questions on about 5,000 experiencers who participated in our studies. They have conveyed the same cautionary remarks regarding nuclear weapons and our environment to experiencers across this planet. Our technological progress is out of balance with our spiritual growth, and this is a danger to our planet. They have been collecting DNA from flora and fauna for 70 years or more. When our governments refused to meet with them, they went directly to the people around the world. I have worked with experiencers around the world, and MUFON has for many, many years. When I was the director of experiencer research of that team, we got about 100 reports a month. So many, many people have had this experience. They are here to protect our quadrant of the galaxy, they say, and they mean no harm. They work quietly, so they will not be perceived as invaders, and there is much fear-based information about them, because fear sells, and people who are anxious to make a lot of money on that portray these ETs as being horrible creatures who terrorize or kill humans. And this is one of the shows that I was on. It's been recently televised on the Travel Channel. It's the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, and it's also available on the Discovery Channel. The reason I have that is that this production company 1895 Films, is considered to be the most ethical company in Hollywood. They were willing to look at my files. They were willing to look at the evidence. No one else in history wanted to give evidence that Betty and Barney actually saw the craft close up, that Barney saw the non-human entities, about the roadblock, about the fiery orb, and all of those things. They wanted you to believe that they were traveling through upstate New Hampshire. They just saw a light in the sky that seemed to follow them, and then Betty had a series of dreams. They realized they were home 2 hours later than anticipated. That's a false story. You heard the true story, or at least part of it. Today, if you go to the Discovery Plus channel, you will hear all of it, or you can read it in my updated book, too. So I was very pleased with that. This is my latest book, just released this year. It's my personal struggle with the unknown that has carried me through the twists, turns, and glimpses of mysterious realities, and my coveted work and the secret knowledge that I acquired through groundbreaking research and working with an experiencer who started channeling ETs. and I had done the hypnosis on him. We assembled a team of researchers over a 2-year period. We were able to ask questions. I published 120 of them in the book with the ET's answers, specific answers. And also, I've never said this publicly, but when I was 17 and my Aunt Betty was doing experiments with scientists to try to call in craft to land on my grandparents' farm, a craft did come in. It landed. It was observed by 2 people, and it took my mother and I that night. And so all of that is in my book, too. I had to be 74 years old before I'd reveal it, but it's there because I don't care what people think any longer. Thank you. And my updated, captured with the new scientific evidence, and my other 4 books, and my website. All of the books are at a discount, though I don't have all of them. I've sold out of some, but I have, I believe, 4 left. And I'll be out in the vendor room tomorrow all day long if you haven't picked it up yet. My husband's out there now. So I want to thank you very much. How many of you are going to be coming tonight? Okay, we'll see you right here at that time. So thank you so much. I appreciate your attendance.